Melissa Anderson asked me in opening this plenary if I would note that research integrity, not to everyone's surprise, remains in the news, including in an editorial in the New York Times today. I read the editorial, and I wish they had written it actually after they came to the World Conference and not before they came to the World Conference, because they might have written a more intelligent editorial or a better one. However, I also talked to somebody who was cited in the editorial and said, what do you mean it's not a good editorial? It's a good editorial. So anyway, but it's interesting. It certainly is. And it reinforces what I think a lot of us know, and that is research integrity is in the news, and what do we do about it, and particularly how do we foster and improve integrity. I've been involved in numerous world conferences, and I can tell you funders are very important for world conferences. We would not exist without them. So they shape research in many ways, including by sponsoring conferences like this. In this conference, Plenary E, which it's my pleasure to chair, I'm Nick Stenek from the University of Michigan, and it's my pleasure to chair this session. They're going to talk about the role of funders in driving change in the research system. So we're going to start with, are you the largest funder in the world? No. Okay, we're going to start with Susan Zimmerman, who is at the Secretariat on Responsible Conduct of Research in Canada and very heavily involved in the World Conference in Montreal, and she will be talking on challenges in promoting the responsible conduct of research, perspectives of public funders. So public funder, Susan Zimmerman, come on up.
So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to address you on the topic of challenges faced from the perspective of public funders. But some of what I say, I hope will be seen as presenting challenges more generally in the promotion of responsible conduct of research. And sorry, I won't be able to take questions here, but I'm sure I can be attacked at the Samba event. So first I want to ask this question: why does responsible conduct of research matter? I mean, it matters to us. For some of us, it's the focus of our life, but for the average researcher and member of the public, why does it matter? Well, research is an enterprise that's built on trust, and I would say trust and relationships. And the responsible conduct of research is the foundation for that trust. It's the basis for establishing and maintaining both the scientific rigor of research and the respectful, and if I can use the word ethical, relationships that sustain it. And this point has been highlighted during the conference by someone who pointed out that integrity has a very almost physical sense of wholeness. But what we're really talking about when we talk about the integrity of research is a moral integrity or an ethical integrity, and I think that's good to keep in mind. So without responsible conduct of research, without that scientific rigor and those ethical relationships, the research enterprise weakens, and pieces of it may collapse entirely. What are the elements of responsible conduct of research? And this is just my own, first of all, the disclaimer. The views I will express here today are my own alone and not the views of the 3 research agencies that employ me. So this is a way I have that helps me think of 2 aspects or 2 components of responsible conduct of research. And one is the integrity, the scientific integrity of the research itself. Is it valid? Is it reliable? Is it accurate? And the other is, as I say, the moral integrity of the process, of the research process. So responsible conduct of research is about doing sound, accurate, reliable research with moral integrity and throughout the life cycle of the research project. And I really want to emphasize that, because I think we spend a lot of time talking about a narrow slice of a research. Sometimes it's the results that we're concerned about only, and we lose sight of the track that responsible conduct of research begins the moment you conceive of the research question, when you submit an application for funding, all of these are part of research and must be done responsibly. And to operate effectively, RCR cannot be viewed as an occasional undertaking or a periodic obligation. Oops, I'd better make sure that I pass ethics review. Or oops, I'd better make sure that I acknowledge all the contributors. It should be seen as an innate part of research, as I said, from beginning to end. So let's break that down. When we talk about the integrity of the research itself, so it must be conceived and conducted with rigor. The data must be recorded and interpreted accurately and in conformity with scientific standards. And the analysis and the conclusions must be sound and verifiable. So, as a researcher, you need to ask yourself, are the results of my research reliable? Have I proved an original hypothesis? Have I validated the work of others by reproducing their results or demonstrating that their results are reproducible? Or have I demonstrated that the findings of others cannot be reproduced? This is also a valid undertaking. These all go to the actual science itself. Whoops, I'm just randomly. And then there's the integrity, the moral integrity of the process. This goes to the conduct of the research in relation to others. The integrity that they demonstrate with respect to the treatment of all those involved in the research, and with compliance with legal, ethical, and disciplinary norms. And why have I separated these two out? Because sound science is not enough, actually. When we talk about responsible conduct of research, we are not just talking about research that is scientifically accurate. Where credit for work is not attributed to those who did it, where the treatment of participants was unethical, this too is a failure of integrity, even if the research results are accurate. So here are some questions to consider. Was I honest in my grant application? So did I get my funds on an honest basis? Did I give credit where credit was due to my colleagues and collaborators? Did I appropriately and adequately reference the sources on which I relied? In research involving human participants, did I respect ethical guidance? Did I obtain informed consent? Did I use research animals in accordance with appropriate guidelines? Do I handle biohazards in a safe way? Do I respect applicable law and regulations? Do I appropriately manage my conflicts of interest? Do I use my research funds properly, that is, for the purpose for which they were intended, and not for my own personal profit? And I say that even if, say, I used 50% of them and got the job done, and then thought, oh, that's okay, I'll use the other 50% to buy a car. Is that okay? Or is there some harm there too? And I think what I would like to emphasize in this talk is that it's all of a piece. It's not okay just to do the science well, and it's also not okay just to treat everyone ethically and follow the process properly. As we saw most eloquently pointed out in Liz Wager's plenary talk this morning, wasteful research, as she was terming it, a waste of resources, answering a question that's already been answered, all of these things actually are not ethically sound, and all of them undermine responsible conduct of research. So as you can see, I'm using a broad definition. So what do departures from responsible conduct of research look like? Well, obviously, from the scientific aspect, a departure would be the fabrication of data, the falsification of results, and also errors in the analysis of data. And I know for some of you, this is going to start looking a little odd because we're often used to talking just about misconduct and everything else. And I want to present to you a paradigm where you're looking at conduct along a spectrum, and I'm grouping things a little bit differently. So the first thing I want to note is that these failures need not be intentional. Let me say that again. These failures need not be intentional. So you are conducting research irresponsibly if you don't analyze data properly, if you don't record data properly, if you don't care whether your research question has already been answered, but you're going to put 150 subjects through a trial needlessly. Errors due to lack of attention, poor record keeping, and honest mistakes may all result in an impaired research record. To me, it's actually more shocking when poor science is not intentional. For people to fail to randomize a trial, to fail to be blinded as to outcomes, and the other examples that Liz gave this morning, those are all examples where research failed to meet the standards of good science. Underpowered studies are a waste. Asking questions that have already been definitively answered are a waste, and they are actually not good science. Then there are the departures from RCR with respect to the moral integrity of the process. So that could be incorrect information on a grant application. Again, intentional or not, if you're gaming the system or gaining an advantage because you have negligently failed to say that, no, you actually haven't got your PhD yet, or no, actually those 2 articles have not yet been accepted for publication. All these things factor into who gets funds and how you get ahead. So inappropriate attribution, of course, misuse of research funds, plagiarism, of course, failure to obtain informed consent, and there are, of course, I'm sure you can all think of many other examples where the procedure that you follow is not up to snuff. It does not comply with standards of responsible conduct of research. And note again that the focus is on the conduct itself, not the intention behind it. Misuse of funds is a waste, whether that misuse is due to ignorance of the rules or an intention to profit. And while deliberate wrongdoing is obviously a more serious matter, poor practices that attract no consequences are more likely to be repeated. And lack of consequences, because it was an honest mistake, may and likely will be interpreted as tacit approval of the poor practice. So poor practice with no consequences leads to more poor practice. And that's not good for science. And it's not good for trust in science. What are the consequences of RCR breaches? Again, where there's lack of scientific integrity, where the science lacks rigor or accuracy, this, of course, can lead to loss of public trust in scientific findings. It can lead to a diminished investment in research, or a diminished commitment to invest in research, both by public and by private funders. And last but certainly not least, it can lead to potential harm to the public. So we need to always ask ourselves, is science reliable? These kinds of RCR failures lessens the power of science to be persuasive. How much are we going to be likely to believe a result that follows on a large scandal or a blowing up of a theory that was held to be true for many years and was found to be based, say, on fabrication? So it may affect the willingness of funders, and in particular public funders, I think, who are so squeezed to commit to investing in the areas of research that are tainted. Rightly or wrongly, there's a public perception that public funders respond to, and where an area has attracted bad research, it's very hard to convince the public that their tax dollars should go to more of the same. The impact is, of course, worse when the problems arise from misconduct, but poor science, even if honest, will also undermine public trust once it's exposed. It calls into question not only the competence of the researcher, but also the legitimacy of the system that permitted that research to be funded, approved, published. So it reflects poorly on the entire research enterprise. The consequences where there's a lack of integrity in the research process Where a researcher has failed to treat others involved in research appropriately, that too can lead to loss of trust by researchers in their colleagues. How much will you be willing to share or collaborate with a colleague who has plagiarized from you or not credited you appropriately? There's also a loss of trust in the ability of institutions, funders, and journals to adequately enforce RCR standards. So here the question is, are scientists trustworthy? The loss of trust in how scientists treat others, there will be a loss of trust even if their results are reliable. So that's why I separate out the two, because scientists may be brilliant, but they may treat their colleagues abysmally. They may ignore rules of obtaining a proper informed consent from participants. They may treat animals without respect and without regard to appropriate regulations, which can lead to, as I say, a reluctance to collaborate with them, a reluctance to fund them, a reluctance to trust institutions to properly monitor. It actually, the errors or the lack of integrity of a researcher, particularly if they are fairly senior or well-known, will call into question the integrity of the institution that allowed them to continue to operate, of the funder who gave them money, and of the entire research system. So the judgment from the public can be quite harsh and difficult to repair. And participants certainly will be reluctant to engage in research. I know that's only one aspect of research, research involving humans, but we all know of instances where poor treatment of certain populations have led to decades of distrust by those populations of engaging in research at all. Let's recall that research participation is a voluntary activity. And if, for example, I know in my own country where First Nations peoples and other Indigenous peoples have been over-researched and exploited by research, there is an extreme reluctance to trust researchers and to trust that they are doing anything of benefit. Certainly after the Tuskegee syphilis experiments in the United States, the outcome of that and the impact of that on generations of African Americans and their lack of trust of researchers, we're still living through the ripple effects of that. So where scientists do not treat others, whether it's colleagues, students, funders, ethically and professionally, it erodes respect for researchers and the research enterprise, even if the scientific outcomes they arrive at are correct. Responsible conduct of research is, of course, a shared responsibility. So we've spent some time in sessions, I know in sessions that I've participated in, saying, well, this is what funders should do, well, this is what researchers should do, oh, this is what institutions should do. And the truth is that we all have a part to play. To maintain the validity and integrity of the research enterprise, responsibility must be shared among researchers, institutions, peer reviewers, funders, publishers, the media. But I think that today I want to talk a little bit more specifically about public funders, who I feel have a special responsibility because they act on behalf of the public. That's who the money comes from, and there is a social responsibility to advance knowledge for the benefit of the public, to allocate public funds responsibly, to ensure that public funds are used for their intended purpose, and to ensure that the knowledge gained is shared. Oh, and that's the end. Over to you. But as a little addendum. So I think public funders need to consider how their own policies and practices can affect and have an impact on the promotion of RCR or the lack of promotion of it. Enforcement of standards, I want to say, is not enough. Often people look to public funders to set standards, and that is an important role that they play. But that enforcement role is definitely, in my view, not enough. Focusing on, for example, misconduct without paying adequate attention and committing resources to supporting RCR through training and mentoring is like a healthcare system that has excellent emergency rooms but doesn't help people to quit smoking or maintain a healthy weight. The impact of those efforts is going to be limited. We must not mistake a state-of-the-art emergency room with an excellent healthcare system. Support and encouraging the support of those who mentor well is really important. It starts from the ground up. Learning through example and education is much more likely to have a lasting impact than receiving sanctions for breach. So there you have the role of the educational system, of institutions, of supervisors and directors. And I think funders have a role to play in assisting with the education of those people and supporting that. We talked in our focus session about different incentives that we might give for that kind of right conduct, and I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Do funders appreciate time spent? Do they acknowledge time spent by senior researchers mentoring their students? Maybe they're not given enough credit for that, but that is in fact one of the most important roles they can play. So, and to promote RCR, funders and others in the research enterprise must pay attention to the full spectrum of good research practices, as I said again, through the entire life cycle of the process, from the formulation of the research question, the design of the application for funding, the conduct of the research, the analysis of the data and its dissemination. And all of that can be done well or it can be done poorly. And poor performance at any stage of the research life cycle is not responsible and should be corrected. And I emphasize it should be corrected. Whether or not it should be sanctioned or punished or disciplined is another question, and only, I would say, a small subset of irresponsible conduct calls for sanctions. We spend a lot of our time talking about those sanctions. What should they be? How should we impose them? What evidentiary standard should they come up to? And not, in my view, enough time talking about the need for bringing attention to poor performance and bringing correction to that. So we spend a disproportionate, in my view, amount of time on that subset. Must stop doing that. Yes, Dr. Freud. There are different kinds of challenges that public funders face. Some are challenges to the funding process itself. We have our own constraints. We have, someone's trying to get in, it's very popular. Financial constraints, obviously. Our budgets are not necessarily as large as we would like them to be. They are set through a political process of a government trying to set priorities among many competing and pressing priorities. This is another way in which each scandal, each exposure of poor conduct, each evidence of lack of competence can make it difficult for funders to argue that more funding for basic research is necessary and deserved. There are also challenges to how we uphold the standards that we set. As I said before, setting the standards is not enough. And I want to talk a little bit more about how we can do that properly. So when it comes to public funding processes and responsible conduct, is the process for reviewing and awarding grants consistent? So do we do our own job in accordance with RCR? So when we make award decisions, are they objective? Are they based on relevant and appropriate criteria? Or do they involve a lot of conflict of interest? Do peer reviewers have the appropriate expertise to do their job? And do they do it in keeping with the confidentiality that is absolutely imperative to that role? Is conflict of interest properly avoided or managed? Are the terms of the application clear? Have we provided any assistance to applicants so that they can understand our processes and what we expect of them? Or do we just leave them to their own devices and then slap them on the wrist or not fund them when they get it wrong? Is there a mechanism for applicants to appeal, or at least to understand better why funding was denied to them? So I think funders must always consider in what ways their own processes may help to promote or may discourage responsible conduct of research. And as I say, this was in itself a subject of the focus track session that took place over the last 2 days, and maybe tomorrow at the plenary there will be a chance to highlight some of the suggestions made there. But for now, I'd just like to signal some of the ways in which funders' policies and practices may affect RCR directly or indirectly. So how do we handle RCR allegations? So we've set the standards. Are they clear, for one thing? Do people understand how to bring an allegation concerning breach of RCR? Are they even aware that there are a set of standards? So are we educating, are we doing enough outreach so that researchers understand that there are that they have rights and that there is a process and that there's a way to implement that process? And is that process clear and fair, and is it seen to be fair for assessing those complaints and addressing them? And is there an effective enforcement mechanism? It's one thing to acknowledge that something has gone wrong. It's another thing to correct it. So I think people get discouraged when they see, you talk about raising expectations. I think there's a discouragement when there's an acknowledgement that something has gone wrong or been done wrong, and they see no consequences as a result. So that perhaps may be more depressing, and also be a disincentive to act well oneself. If one sees that there are no consequences to acting badly, that's certainly not a good lesson. So just as we expect researchers to meet standards of responsible conduct, funders must uphold and be seen to uphold those standards fairly, effectively, and efficiently within timelines, because overlong delays in how we address complaints in itself can be a form of irresponsible conduct. I want to talk specifically of one of the most vexed questions that I face. And I know it's a concern faced by other funders as well, particularly public funders, subject to privacy laws. The appropriate balance between the transparency of the process and the protection of the privacy rights of those involved in the process. And that would be both the rights of complainants and of respondents. So we often talk about the need to protect complainants, whistleblowers who are often very courageous and put their careers on the line. There are two sides to that. And respondents, of course, who may be wrongly or unfairly accused. This is why privacy at the stage of the investigation is seen as a very important value and one that has to be upheld. But there are, of course, also transparency interests. Funders and employers should know whether researchers have violated RCR guidelines. We certainly are aware of cases where we have found someone to have transgressed RCR in very serious ways, and they have then moved institutions or moved into industry. So they are still acting as researchers, but the people they are collaborating with are not necessarily aware of what they have done, and we think that is problematic. But where is the appropriate balance? Both complainants and respondents have an interest in privacy protection. Both may suffer unfairly as a result of their involvement in an RCR allegation. And most would acknowledge that whistleblowers often suffer disproportionately, but careers and reputations have also been unfairly tarnished, in some cases ruined, by allegations that turn out to be groundless if they become public. So privacy protection is very important, and we take it seriously. But the importance of transparency, and here the public has often held our feet to the fire. It is not sufficient in this day and age to tell the public, trust us, we are enforcing RCR standards, we are ensuring that your money is well invested. They don't want to hear that, trust us. It doesn't come off well coming from government. So we have certainly taken steps to ensure that, at least with respect to serious breaches, we make sure that all researchers, as they're applying for funding, consent to our publicizing in the event that consent to our making public in the event they are ever found to have committed a serious breach of RCR. We can make that public, and we have their consent to do that. That is a condition of funding. I note that I discovered the other day that in Denmark, in fact, as a result of a decision of their ombudsman to Parliament, all RCR investigations are publicly available and accessible from the time the investigation is launched. So that's kind of the other aspect. I'd like to talk about the repeat complainant, and I'm going to try and do that without going on a rant because time is running out. The repeat complainant is my polite way of saying people who are obsessive about laying complaints. They are not necessarily well-founded complaints. They are not necessarily based on altruistic intentions. And often it is well known to the people receiving the complaints that they are likely to be trivial, unfounded, and done for the worst of motives, personal motives, vendettas. They hate the institution. They hate everyone who is in that department. It's an old grievance they have against a former supervisor. How do you balance the requirement to pursue all allegations seriously with the need to avoid the misuse and, I would say, the abuse of public resources? I think everyone in the room here who has been involved on behalf of an institution or a funder in investigations have their own horror stories about the amount of time they have spent with one complainant who makes repeated complaints, sometimes about relatively trivial matters, but who cannot simply be dismissed. I do feel it is a public duty to take all allegations seriously, and even somewhat deranged people may be coming to you with a legitimate complaint, and that certainly does happen. So you can't dismiss them out of hand. But the amount of time and resources, human resources, which are quite limited in our offices, as well as financial resources, is absolutely extraordinary. If anyone were ever to do a study of that, I think the disproportionate impact of one or two not so well-intentioned people and people who are not quite clear on the concept would be astonishing. And it is, if you're talking about a waste of resources, that's where it is. Although many of us have provisions for dismissing malicious or frivolous claims, we are reluctant to use them, reluctant to be seen as being the powerful government that's just dismissing the poor little complainant. So people take the sort of easier route, in a sense, and treat all of these with a consideration that actually many of them don't warrant. Then there's the repeat offender challenge, the scientist who has been found beyond all possible doubt to have committed egregious, irresponsible research, and who doesn't believe, oh, time is out, sorry, I will wrap up, and who doesn't believe, well, who believes they're a little bit above the law. And that comes back to the distinction I was making between good science and good conduct. They feel that if they're an excellent researcher, compliance with RCR is kind of optional. And it's very difficult to rein those people in. Often they continue to attract good funding and continue to enjoy a good reputation, and that's where transparency might be rather a good idea. I will leave you with my inability to click properly. I'll leave you with a few conclusions. I just did want to refer to the Singapore Statement, which talks about good stewardship, and I think that is all of our responsibility with respect to research. And just leave you with these concluding thoughts. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Kevin Moses from the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and he will speak about research integrity. What is a science funder to do? And we hope to hear what they should do.
Boa tarde. Gostava de agradecer o convite para estar aqui presente. Uma conduta científica é problema sério e dá particular prazer ver tantos de nós aqui presentes para discutir este tópico. Esta é a minha primeira visita a este belo país. Infelizmente, atingi agora o limite do meu português, pero que terei de continuar em inglês. Thank you for inviting me. It's very good to be here. So, I had prepared a very focused talk, which may still get us out on time, but through the last couple of days, some other things have come up. So I've inserted a few more points to put in here. So first of all, who am I? Just to give you a little calibration. I'm Kevin Moses. I was originally a geneticist, worked on fruit fly developmental biology, was a graduate student in Cambridge, England. Then I went to the US and stayed there 25 years and had most of an academic career, going through postdoc and being professor in a couple of places, and ended up then moving to Howard Hughes Medical Institute 2005 into an administrative position, starting up a new research campus at Genelia Farm. And in 2011, I was pulled back to the UK to the Wellcome Trust. So I'll tell you a few things about the Wellcome Trust a little bit further along. Unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know, because I'm not allowed to. And therein lies the problem. And as I will explain about that at the end of my talk. So I'm really only going to talk about one thing, and I'm going to end up by making one point. Okay, here's a slide you've seen before, not very long ago. There have been concerns raised very recently about the reproducibility of science. As you know, Bayer has found that most academic results are not reproducible in their labs. And likewise, Amgen found that a large majority of the results they tried to reproduce were also not going to carry through. So we clearly have a problem, but really this is not my topic today. Today I'm going to focus only on malicious misconduct. Not that one. In effect, science crime. Why it's a serious problem. What we do about it now, and what should we change to do more. I'm talking about deliberate efforts on the part of researchers to fabricate, falsify, or plagiarize their studies. And although we've heard numbers that this is not causing the majority of the actual damage, I think it causes a very large proportion of the damage to trust. It's disproportionately important. It's because science is really our route to finding the objective truths about nature, about medicine, about the world around us. And we need people to trust that science is being conducted properly, not under special interest, not in any malicious way to distort it. So science is testable, falsifiable, and has a higher claim to the trust of non-scientists than other systems that claim to deliver the truth, be they based on precedent, dogma, authority, or other things. Science really matters because it works. It delivers solutions to real problems. Quoting Susan Zimmerman a few minutes ago, responsible conduct of research is the basis of that trust. So this was published in The Economist recently. It's been proposed, and this is data from the US, but I think the US may have led, but most of the rest of the world is undergoing similar curve, that most of the increase of wealth and prosperity in the US and now the rest of the planet is due to innovation. So this curve since about 1800 is not because people have worked harder or become more intelligent or anything like that. It's because of innovation, better ways of working, better technologies, more efficiencies. True for the economy, true for medicine, true for public health, This is what science delivers. It's the foundation of what enables us all to be right here, right now, today in this room. Not hungry, not hot or too cold. This is what makes the current planet viable. So it's hugely important that non-scientists, non-engineers, non-physicians have a reasonable understanding of how science works so that they can trust the outputs and ask for themselves what the evidence may be. There's a deep need to educate people to enough scientific literacy to be able to do that. People need to know that science is delivering the truth and they can check that themselves, as opposed to other sources of information such as advertising, entertainment, dare I say it, even politics. So we need, for these positive effects to come through, we need people to trust the science. When people don't trust science, then perhaps they don't have their children vaccinated and some children die. Genetic modified organisms are feared and more people than otherwise necessary go hungry. When people mistrust the healthcare information delivered by healthcare workers, their very ignorance can kill them. Within the last year, we've seen enormous death toll in West Africa in the Ebola epidemic. That epidemic turned around for reasons that we don't fully understand yet, but before the arrival of drugs, before the arrival of hospitals, before any designed interventions, must have been through behavior change of the people in West Africa. That at the point that they could understand what caused the transmission of the disease, how you could catch it, how to avoid catching it, they were effectively able to save themselves. So the very information understanding the transmission of the disease today, this year, we can see saves enormous numbers of lives. So when the public trust is betrayed by scientists themselves, it's through deliberate fraud, then that trust is undermined. And we really need to have people trust our scientists more than the advertisers, more than the bankers, because if they don't do it, it can kill them. So I'm going to take a little side trip into the history of the Wellcome Trust. So Wellcome Trust was set up in 1936. It was built on a pharmaceutical company by Sir Henry Wellcome, who founded it. It was the Wellcome Foundation, and it was the sole owner, the charity became the sole owner of the company at that point. And there was income through pharmaceutical sales. And at that point, then the company became owned by the charity, and the charity was started with the purpose of advancing medical and scientific research to improve mankind's well-being and to increase the understanding and history of medicine. So we're a global charitable foundation dedicated to achieving extraordinary improvements in human and animal health. Our interests range from science to the history of medicine to public engagement, and we're independent of political and commercial interests. And the history really was that in about just after the year 2000, the charity divested itself of the company and invested the income from that into a diversified endowment. I'll come back to that in a minute. So what we do essentially is take the money from that endowment and use it to fund research, largely. So we have 3 focus areas. We support research, it's the first one. We accelerate the application of research. We have a section of the Wellcome Trust that looks to support translation, cover the valley of death as inventions from academia get into companies. And we have a section that explores medicine in historical and cultural contrast. We have 5 different challenges, basically genetics and genomics, neuroscience, infectious disease, development, aging, and chronic disease, and the environment, nutrition, and health. So just recently, the trust endowment crossed 20 billion UK, 30 billion US. That money is invested, and fortunately, that number is rising. That doesn't have to continue, but we're enjoying good financial times. And so in 2014, we spent over 600 million pounds, pushing towards $1 billion in different kinds of grant funding. And I won't pick through the details, but basically 83% went into science, 11% went into innovations or translational activities, 6% to culture and society. So we invest not only in the science itself, we do that through investing in people. We do training, everything from PhD programs, clinical training, clinical research training, through to individual grants and awards to PIs, early career, mid-career, very senior people. We do, including we do collaborative awards, grants to groups of researchers who come in with a proposal. We do strategic investments in large things, largest being the Sanger Genome Institute in Hinxton near Cambridge, about 2,000 people working there, about £100 million a year, $150 million, doing large-scale genomics and other kinds of research. We also have 8 UK institutes within universities that we call centers, and we also invest about 20% of our research funding outside the United Kingdom in low and middle income countries. The largest thing we do is have major overseas programs. There are 5 of those, 3 in Africa, 2 in Southeast Asia. But there are a number of other activities in low and middle income countries, mostly focused on infectious disease, such as Ebola, such as malaria, flu, HIV, TB. So coming back to the topic at hand then. So we are deeply invested, both from our history and our commitment to making all this science work, all the way from the most basic science, all the way through to innovations that will reduce death from malaria and other diseases. So that is our core, and for that to work, there has to be public trust in science. So coming back, why do people fake science? We've come to expect that as normal from people who want to sell us dietary supplements, unscientific therapies, cosmetics. But why would real scientists ever do this? And we've been discussing this for several days here already, but mostly for the reasons of greed and fear. They want to either advance themselves, or they're in fear that they will fail to advance their careers or safeguard their jobs. They need that big grant, they need that hot paper. They sometimes are tempted to take shortcuts, and sometimes they give in to that temptation. So scientists are human, temptation is there. And I just thought I'd trot through a few famous cases that you probably have heard of. So here's a grand old one from the turn of the last century. Piltdown Man, probably Charles Dawson, we don't absolutely know for sure, glued a human cranium onto an orangutan jaw, played with the teeth, and sold this as the missing link in human evolution. Paul Kammerer, a little bit later in the 20th century, was trying to prove a new theory of evolution, Lamarckian evolution, perhaps for political reasons, and so he changed the coloring of frogs' feet in order to show that they would be inheriting that change as they changed their mating behavior. Famous book from Arthur Koestler about that. In more recent times, and I could give you many, many examples. I'll just trot through a couple more. Mark Hauser in Harvard, who was accused, and Harvard upheld those accusations, that he optimistically interpreted video recordings of the behaviors of monkeys in sort of social science behavior experiments. More recently, Joachim Bolt, drug research fraud. Many, many, many more cases, and we've been talking about them. They exist. So really, we could ask, how frequent is this? It's hard to say due to the very nature. It's mostly hidden. The British Medical Journal in 2012, 1 in 7 UK-based scientists had witnessed colleagues intentionally altering or fabricating data during their research or for the purposes of publication, from a survey of almost 3,000 researchers, about 13%. So we require, as we come across cases like this, people report cases to the Wellcome Trust, people report cases to their universities. We require that, and I know this is the same in the US, where unfortunately in my previous jobs I had to do my own investigations of misconduct. It is necessary that confidentiality is very tight and maintained through the investigation. both at an early stage, often called an inquiry, through to a later stage, often called an investigation, because the accusation that has come up is not yet proven, and scientists' reputations are very important. And all kinds of damage can be done, so things have to stay confidential. But when the complaint is upheld, then often we don't take the next step, which is to make public what has really been found. And at this meeting, I should have known this before, but I looked at the Office of Research Integrity website and saw all the cases that are described after the investigations. And people are named, many such cases, and that's very clear. Unfortunately, in the UK, that is not so, and I think that's also true for many countries. So in 2012, the Organization of the Universities, Universities UK, published a concordat to support research integrity, which the Wellcome Trust signed up to. And the requirements of that concordat are that accusations are investigated. If we funded them, the university has to notify us that an investigation has begun. And when the investigation has reached a conclusion, either positive or negative, that the accusation is upheld or it's not, we get a report that that's happened and what the outcome is. But it's for the university to decide what to do next. And we are not permitted to do anything more about it without the university's lead. And I can tell you that in the majority of cases, in fact, all the cases except one I'm going to tell you about, universities have chosen not to make public the finding of these investigations, even when the finding is upheld. So I know of a number of cases where the person who actually did the fraud was moved out and now has jobs elsewhere. But there's one very clear example, and I'm going to talk about this because it contains one of my heroes here now. So, sorry, this is actually Nature picked up on this just last week, that universities are not actually publishing these misconduct reports. Okay. So I'm going to tell you about a story that involves two people. My hero is Tony Siegel, who's a professor of immunology at University College London. And he discovered in 2006, detected that a postdoc in his lab, Jatinder Ahwalia, had fabricated information going into a paper. And he did that. It's involved looking at gels and understanding that the images had been fabricated. And he made the complaint. He himself, the PI, registered a complaint with the university that his postdoc had apparently done this. And then, at Tony's insistence, the university established a complaints procedure, brought in lawyers, produced a solid procedure that would work to come to a true finding, which eventually it did. And it was in the mainline newspapers in London. Here it is in the Times Higher, explaining how this fraud had been detected, explaining that this person, Ahwalia, had committed the fraud. By then, he was, Ahwalia, a faculty member at another London university, and eventually, after some legal procedures, he is no longer doing that. Shortly thereafter that, Siegel looked at the thesis that Ahwalia had written and saw the same things in there, and that was from a PhD project done at Imperial College in London, and that is still under investigation. There are some technical issues, but that is ongoing. But this also came out, see if we can move forward, into the newspapers, that not only was there fraud in the thesis work at Imperial, but this was his second stop. Before that, he'd been a PhD student at Cambridge, and for reasons not yet revealed, had been moved out of Cambridge and then picked up by Imperial. So Tony Siegel stopped this train at the third stop, and two other universities had not done so. And I don't think it was detected at Imperial, but Cambridge definitely had reasons to move the person out. So this is just about the unique case that I know in the UK that is public. There are other cases that are not public. I think we really need to be following the lead of the ORI in the US and making clear when somebody finally, when it is absolutely clear, beyond a reasonable doubt, at the end of the investigation, that the person, after all the appeals, that somebody has actually done an act like this, they need to be revealed and out of science, not only just to remove them from doing further damage, but also really so that everybody else in science understands what this really is. Because if it's a taboo and we never talk about it, I mean, it's a sort of a bad analogy. Remember how far HIV spread in the US, in some other countries, when it was a taboo and not talked about. We need sunlight. We need to take these cases out and make them clear. And really, another thing we've been talking about at this meeting, this is really to the credit of Tony Siegel, that this is not to his detriment that this bad thing happened in his lab. His exemplary action following this has reversed that damage into actually benefit for everybody. And PIs, or whoever it is that's going to reveal problems in the lab, needs to be our heroes. They need to be rewarded. They need to be protected. This is the behavior we have to encourage. So, as I said at the start, I haven't been able to tell you anything you didn't already know, or could find out on Google at least, because I'm not allowed to, and that's really the problem. I wish I could tell you about the other cases that I've personally investigated or that I know are sitting in our files, but because of the way the current structure exists, because of fear of the libel laws, because institutions are worried about their reputations, we cannot take this to the step that it needs to go. So scientists are currently far more trusted than bankers. But as you can see, pouring in the newspapers in the last few days, this is eroding, and we need not to get to where the bankers are. Thank you.